I'm Greg Gutfeld with Kimberly Guilfoyle, Juan Williams, Eric Bowling, and she pole vaults with a chopstick, Dana Perino, the 5. Did you know that the Paris climate talks emit 300,000 tons of CO2? Here's some of that gas.
This is an economic and security imperative that we have to tackle now. Everybody else is taking climate change really seriously. They think it's a really big problem.
Your deliberations over the next 2 weeks will decide the fate not only of those alive today, but also of generations yet unborn.
Let's just imagine for a moment what we would have to say to our grandchildren if we failed. What was it that was so difficult when the Earth was in peril? When the sea levels were rising in 2015, when crops were failing, when deserts were expanding, what was it that was so difficult?
And then the media added their own stink.
The president warns it will soon be too late to stop climate change. We find evidence in China's pollution emergency and in the melting Arctic.
The scientists say what happens up here is what's going to happen to all of us.
There's never been anything like it. 150 world leaders under one roof in high-stakes talks targeting climate change.
Overseas tonight into Paris and to that unprecedented climate change summit tonight. A major gathering of world leaders, nearly 150 in all, including, of course, President Obama, who said today the United States deserves some of the blame for climate change.
What self-perpetuating poop. You got to wonder why such drama hasn't been directed at terror. Maybe it's the difference between those who fight for such causes. The climate crazies are elitists, lavishly educated, expensively caffeinated, and predominantly white. The older and richer they are, the more this elite status becomes obvious. See Prince Charles, Leo DiCaprio, Al Gore, still there. But I beg you, try finding a poor Indian, a working-class Asian, or a struggling Latino on the activist front, trampling over the shrines to the Paris attacks. No, they are almost entirely white European elitists who wish to deny cheap fuel to the billion third world not on the electricity grid. Maybe they're racist. As Prince Charles falsely links drought to terror, this war on cheap resources is a more likely link. For when you ensure poverty to a billion people, a death cult becomes viable. So climate panic helps terror in two ways: by diverting resources from the fight and punishing the poor. Now let's look at those who see terror as a bigger threat than climate change. They aren't in Hollywood. They aren't in the media. They're not tenured. They don't have private jets. They don't drip with royalty or party with Leo on yachts stacked with topless supermodels. They aren't chic. They look like you and, sadly, me. Could that be why the climate crusade gets the summits and the attention and the accolades that terror warriors never get? Imagine if we flipped this and made the war on terror the glamorous one. ISIS wouldn't stand a chance. That's the big question here, Kimberly.
Yep.
Why can't the Western leaders galvanize this sort of interest against terror? It's just too boring, and they know Sean Penn won't show up.
It makes them feel better about themselves. Sure, yes, there's the glamour of the Leo DiCaprios, but you lost Bowling with the topless supermodel situation. He's going to go play for the other team now. They don't want to talk about how great the president should be proud of serving and being commander-in-chief of the greatest military in U.S. history, what they've been able to accomplish, the sacrifices they've made. Instead, he really, really wants to talk about climate. I'm telling you that as soon as he's out of the White House, he's going to have some global climate fund where he can be the climate czar or be in charge of the UN or something that is really in keeping with his worldview. Because the rest of it he finds to be sort of unpleasant and distracting from the tasks at hand that he wishes to achieve.
Made me think it may not be, it's not such a link, being a friend of Bill Ayers, to still be interested in the weather.
Underground.
Yes. Eric, holding a climate
conference. Put it together.
I know,
yeah.
It all makes sense now.
Yeah.
He's holding a climate conference in the age of ISIS. It's like having a slumber party during a famine.
More worried about icicles than ISIS. Yeah,
yes.
Look, it's appalling that he's making such a big deal about this. Okay, so you want to be a climate alarmist, that's fine. We know that's what they do. We know there's a lot of money in it. Tom Steyer is pledging hundreds of millions of dollars every year to make sure that their voice is heard. That's fantastic. Knock yourself out. But not in place of the terror summit, not in place of being concerned about terror, and certainly not blaming the United States for the propagation of terror. In other words, saying terror is increasing because of climate change, and then saying we are this number 2 emitter on the planet, therefore the United States is probably the number 2 reason for terror. How can it not be that link? One, I asked Kirsten Powers yesterday, how come it's just radical Muslims who are affected by climate change and not Christians or Jews? It's the radical Muslims who are perpetrating terror on the world, not the other religious groups.
And you could add to that, there are no ISIS franchises popping up in California during the drought. So there's no linkage there. Juan, okay, have you noticed that this is mainly the hobby of white elitists?
Sure, it's the same charge against the feminists. But it's not to say that if you're a poor kid in Latin America or Asia or Africa, that things like asthma and things like, polluted waters don't matter to you, or
pollution's different than going after carbon.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I mean, coal is cheap fuel that will save the lives of millions of people.
Well, I think that in fact it will, end the lives of lots of people prematurely.
That's what you feel, not think.
Well, no, that's not what I feel. But I think if you go, I don't think that there is any argument over the science at this point. But
what are you talking about?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty much settled science that we have.
Okay, explain to me how that it's settled.
Because I think there's, I'm not a scientist, and I
therefore
think
the science isn't settled.
Because I'm not a scientist.
Well, no, you're saying the science is settled, but you're not a scientist. How can you explain the near 2-decade pause in temperature? How can you explain that Arctic ice is expanding?
I love it.
How can you explain?
Yeah, how do you explain the rise in temperature? I'll tell you this. I think it's rather a cynical spin. Look, I think the Koch brothers, the Exxons, all these guys, the big corporations that pollute, you know what? They feed this industry and they want us all to repeat the same old junk.
What do you?
They want babies to choke on carbon.
Why are you?
No, they make money. They don't want any more regulation of their industry.
So it's actually this is an interesting point, Dan. He stumbled into an interesting truth that the real evil behind this is prosperity. That the people that are coming out on the climate conference are just basically saying it's the Western prosperity.
Which is why you have the developing nations. They are unified because there is a pledge of $100 billion a year from the developed nations, from America to the developing nations. And so you will see them in lockstep because they do look. And if you have been told that your island is going to be underwater, then you take it seriously. The thing that's interesting about this going on in this meeting in Paris, so it's a big UN thing, right? The UN brings them all together. It's so interesting to me how they have totally and wholly ignored the refugee crisis up until it's a crisis. Okay, it was entirely predictable. You could see it happening. It was preventable. And what did Turtle Bay do? Nothing. Okay, a few tweets here and there, but what did they spend most of their time doing? Plotting and planning for these big conferences and the lavish dinner. I just love the photographs of all of the leaders at the big expensive dinner plotting our future. In the meantime, you have coal country in America completely decimated and Hillary Clinton pledging $30 billion in handouts so that she can help rebuild their communities. With what? Solar power is not going to cut it. The other thing you have heard almost nothing about is something that could actually do a lot of good, and that's nuclear power. But you have in Germany a walk away from it. You don't have an ability to permit plants that will actually get funded and completed. So we're actually, I don't understand. It's like we're moving backwards on the bicycle.
The founders of Whole Earth Catalog, I believe, and Greenpeace are pro-nuclear. So they have changed their ideologies. Do you want to talk about the Pope?
Yeah, let's talk about the Pope.
All right.
By the way, I don't think that people are sort of viscerally opposed, Dana, to nuclear power. But I think when people think about accidents in Chernobyl and then that terrible accident over in Japan recently, I think people are cautious. Like, not in my neighborhood, please. But
so the alternative to not doing things smartly and safely and with some safeguards is that we do nothing.
Well, don't do
and we rely on a hope and a prayer that we're going to be able to to basically grow our economy on what? It's not going to grow on wind or solar. In the meantime, you have whole communities across Appalachia in America that are devastated and with 53% unemployment rates.
And there are 3 million people that die every year from burning impure fuels.
And the better we do actually here and the better we do in terms of energy, the way we can actually show innovation in order to
And how about the Keystone Pipeline?
You can get clean coal to work, and then that helps bring 1 billion people out of poverty.
So I know you want to talk about the Pope.
Yeah, I have the Pope's quote. This is the Pope talking about climate change. Can we put that up there? It's now or never, he says. Every year the problems are getting worse. We're at the limits. if I may use a strong word, I would say that we are at the limits of suicide. Now, this is what I like about the Pope. He's the king of the understatement. This declaration, Kimberly,
Yes.
I'm not going to go after the Pope about this, but I find it misguided given that Christians are being persecuted all around the world, and he's choosing this topic, not that.
Well, he's also talked about that, but today
Not like
it's
that.
about the Weather Channel. That's what's happening. So he's making a comment about it. He's obviously, a believer. He's all in on it. I think that's why he was getting along very well with President Obama. I don't mind him saying things about that as long as he speaks out as well about what's happening, the genocide of Christians at the hand of jihadists.
But Gregor, why do you think don't you think it's disingenuous to say he can't talk about persecution of Christians and climate change?
Because he's
or he can't talk about terrorism
because he's wrong.
and climate change?
He's wrong, and he's also wrong on the Charlie Hebdo massacre, in which he laid the blame on the cartoonist, saying that they shouldn't have drawn those cartoons. You remember that?
You know what I think? I think you guys are behind the curve here, because I see now that most Republicans out on the campaign trail are saying, you know what, climate change is real. They have arguments about whether it's caused by humans and the like, but they're saying it's real. You guys are still in the denial phase.
Or climate change?
Both.
Well, because the inconvenient truth is that, as Greg pointed out, a 19-year pause in temperature rise is now birthed a change from global warming to climate change. You can't deny climate change.
You can't deny.
You can't.
You can look over a 100-year period and you see this
warmer,
tremendous.
10,000
But you remember Al Gore? We'll say it again. Al Gore predicted that the northern polar ice cap would be melted by 2013. We'd be freeze-free by 2030.
Hyperbole, ridiculous. Is that your whole point? That's
my
why
point
we
is it's
shouldn't pay
actually
attention to
growing.
climate
It's not
change?
shrinking. It's actually growing. It's up 63% over the last 2 winters.
Look,
Up 63%.
And if you want to bring up politicians, 27% of Democrats favor persecution of climate skeptics in the United States.
Persecution?
Yes. Sorry. Same thing.
Right.
Same thing.
But they
all
really
right.
mean persecution.
They mean persecution.
You know what they do?
Prosecution.
You know what they would do?
Code
What
for
did that happen to that woman in Vegas? They put her in that thing that iced her up and she froze to death. That's what's going to happen to her.
She put
Persecution.
herself in.
And what's it called?
That's a cryo.
But also, Greg, remember, I think it is worth pointing out that what President Obama is trying to commit the United States to at this conference in Paris has been rejected by both majorities in both the House and the Senate and over half of the states. So he's basically betting our future on something that is likely to be overturned in the courts.
Can I just point out, I think it's absolutely disgusting, any world leader that actually links terror to climate change.
Yeah.
It is absolutely disgusting. There's nothing in it for them. There's nothing in it other than to take blame.
That's what ISIS
to divert
wants.
blame.
Yeah.
No, but the worst thing that he said today, too often American leadership is defined by whether or not we're sending troops somewhere.
It's always the weather.
Weather.
All right, coming up, some new battles are brewing between the GOP, that's the grand old party, Dana,
Thank you.
presidential candidates as the first election contest in the nation nears. I read that wonderfully. Rubio versus Cruz, Christie versus Trump. That's next in the 5.